Sermon this morning is entitled, A Sobering Dark Cloud to Every Light. Now, a few weeks ago, we considered the topic, a silver lining to every dark cloud. We considered in Ecclesiastes how it says that there are things which are better than other things, right? Two are better than one. It is better that you enjoy what you have rather than being dissatisfied with what you don't have. So we learn as we went through the book of Ecclesiastes that there are bad times, but we still give thanks for certain things. You know, some of us are eternal optimists. We have learned to see the silver lining in almost everything. You know, when a little child scuffs his knee, we will say to that child, never mind, it'll heal and you will have a battle scar, right? Or, you know, when the prata is burned, then you say, never mind, sometimes crunchy prata is very nice to eat, right? Or when someone fails, then you can say, well, things will get better because you can only go up from here. You can't fall any lower, right? But sometimes we are very unrealistic, right? We're so optimistic that we create false hope, we create false light. You know, God will heal you from total organ failure, you will hear some Christians say. Some people will say, if I just keep on playing, I will win the lottery and make it big. Then there are some people who will say, you know, if I wait for her, then she will leave her boyfriend for me. You know, a lot have been said about millennials. You know, in a bad economy, rising costs, expensive education, fewer opportunities, yet there are people who will reject job offers because they want jobs with better hours. They want better pay, better bosses. Yet when they're jobless, they will still drink their bubble tea. They will take their Grab rides. You know, they will still eat out. Right? So there are eternal optimists, unrealistic, right? You know, they will probably even dream of how their YouTube or TikTok videos will monetize. And this is why we need to consider the dark clouds so that we will grow in sobriety. Yes, there are times when we look at the silver linings, but there are times when we must look at the dark clouds to admit that they are there, to say that we must deal with them. And we know it is tough because we like to see the silver linings, but we need to be realistic. You know, where it is day for some others in the world, it is night for others. So failure to understand this, failure to understand how dark life can be, fails to prepare us for disappointment. Now, in chapters 1 to 6, Solomon has already given his thesis. You know, life under the sun, it is vexation of spirit. All is vanity. Life is messy. You can't change it. Then you die. You know, there's no point hoping in family, in work, in health, and in wealth. These things may give you a bit of reprieve, but in the end, they won't guarantee happiness. And so the constant advice that Solomon has been giving is, although life is messy and dark, you know, enjoy these little things, the silver linings. Enjoy what you can. Now, chapter 7 onwards to the end, it repeats many of these things. So you'll be hearing a lot of repetition. But from chapter 7 onwards, it gives more practical, situational advice. And so starting here, he gives 3 pieces of advice as to how we can go through tough times, through difficult times, through dark clouds. And here in chapter 7, he switches to a proverb-like tone, right? All of these sayings that we have read, they seem to be thrown together randomly like the book of Proverbs. So the way to interpret this is not by going linearly, verse by verse, but it is to pick up the ideas, the cluster of ideas. So from these verses here, we see 3 pieces of advice that Solomon gives. Firstly, we need to be honest about our suffering. Secondly, we need to behave ourselves as we go through suffering. And thirdly, we need to know how to suffer well. So firstly, we need to be honest about our suffering. Many people, they will deny their problems. It's like that proverbial ostrich that put its head into the ground. Perhaps we are people who say, if I don't see it, it's not there. If I don't go to the doctor, I won't know that I'm sick. I'm not sick. No, I'm not sick. I didn't go to the doctor. All right, there are some people who are like this. But we need to be honest. Just because you ignore a problem, it doesn't mean that it's going to go away. Right? But only when we come to terms with it can we be uplifted. Verse 3 says, "For by the sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better." Right? So it is good, it is better to be sad because the heart can be changed, it can be amended. That's what it means. So when we encounter sadness and trials, our hearts can be made better. How do you penetrate a thick skull? How do you acknowledge that there are dark clouds, right? There has to be problems, right, that happen to help you to realize this. There's some people who say, I don't have family problems. Things are fine. I've got no issues. Then what happens? Then disaster. But if you acknowledge, things are not so good, there are issues in my work, my family, my friends, my spiritual life, then and only then can you do something about it. Things can be amended to be better. But the thing is, we're not always honest with our suffering. We forget the past. Verse 10, it says, "Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this." In other words, there's some people who long for the good old days. They say, in my day, things were better. Things were different. We could leave our doors unlocked. There were better morals that people had. But Solomon here is saying, don't long for the good old days. Don't rewrite the past, because things in the past were also bad. There are some of you who will remember the race riots, the gangs, the angqia. There are those of you who lived through the Asian financial crisis. Things were not, bright and happy and cheerful. They were bad times. Yes, today HIV and AIDS is kind of under control with medication, but some of you remember those days when it was some kind of epidemic and pandemic. People were afraid even of touching one another. And that is why Solomon is saying, don't long for the good old days, because it is foolish. Things in the past were not better, and perhaps what you are experiencing today is a result of past problems that were not solved. And many of us live with that in our families, in our jobs, in our various situations. We are living with the scars of the past because we did not solve it. We did not address it. We did not see the dark clouds in the past. So we are not often sober because we try and rewrite the past, but we also downplay present problems. And one of the ways that we downplay present problems is to be like that eternal optimist, to ignore it, to distract ourselves, to party away our problems. Some people take drugs, some people watch a lot of TV, some people do this and that. Verse 2 speaks about how the house of mourning, the funeral home, is better than the house of mirth. All right? There are unpleasant things that happen today. Verse 3 speaks about sorrow. Verse 4 says there is wisdom in mourning. And these are given as contrasts. Better to go to a funeral home than to a party. Better to sorrow than it is to laugh. Mourning is better than the foolishness of partying. Now, why does Solomon say this? Because by nature, we often think otherwise. We prefer parties. We don't like funerals. We would rather avoid mourning. We would rather avoid bad feelings. When there are problems in our lives, we don't face them head on. I have so much to think about, so many problems. Turn on the TV, blast the music, go for a walk or a run to get your endorphins going so that you forget about your problems. We distract ourselves, all right? And, one way often people today deny terrible things is by changing the nature of funerals. Instead of funerals today, what do people want? They want celebrations of life, right? It's true. As if it's wrong to grieve a loved one. Maybe you yourself say, when I die, I don't want my funeral to be sad. I want people to be happy. As if it is a bad thing for your loved ones to mourn you when you go away. Right? Some people have said, we want balloons at my funeral. No black clothes, no crying. According to a funeral director I know, and some of you know, 20 to 30% of his funerals are like that today. It's interesting. Some people envision their weddings, right? But there are people who envision their funerals. But sadness at a funeral is not a bad thing. It is acceptable. It is natural. It is good. In that one sense, yes, when believers die, we rejoice because we know that they're in heaven. But let us not deny the present loss. Let us not deny the present grief. Because a person still has died. Death is still an enemy. And we know that when Christ comes again, that this enemy will completely be wiped out. But until he comes, death is still a reality. It's something that we will be sad about because we're separated from our loved ones. We miss them. And while we shouldn't be trapped by that sadness, we don't run from it. And that is why it is good for us to confront the sad things, to look at all the problems, all the dark clouds in our lives, not to ignore them because it's better for our heart. We will amend it. And that is why it's better to be a funeral director than a wedding planner. It's better to confront with honesty our problems rather than masking them. Not only are we not honest about the past, but the present, but also we're not sober when it comes to future problems. We are optimistic to a fault sometimes as to what will happen. Right now we're living in a terrible, terrible pandemic. People here in Singapore are dying, right? They are dying. But what happened when restrictions eased and we heard news about the vaccinated travel lanes? What happened? I too contributed to the SQ website crash, right? For some bizarre reason, despite all of these things going on, we have forgotten. We think that the future may be good. Yes, it may be. Life has to go on. But immediately there was a switch, a changing of gear. We're not honest about what may happen in the future. Because in verse 13, it tells us that we can't fix all our problems. Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? So what God has made crooked, and that's in the perfect tense, what God has already made crooked and it continues on, we will not be able to, future tense, to make it straight. Things are crooked, but we think that we can fix them in time. Dearly beloved, the fall has happened. Until Christ returns, the world will continue in this fallen state. And while we seek for improvement, while we seek for things like justice, it doesn't mean that it will happen. To be clear, it's not that we sit back and do nothing. We shouldn't be like Doris Day, que sera, sera. If younger folk don't understand that, I don't blame you. all right? We are to work for change, but there's really no guarantee because many things are broken that we can't fix. I mean, you may battle a life-threatening disease, you may get better, but what happens to you eventually? You will die, all right? We labor to see peace and purity even in the church, but until Christ comes, there will be problems in church. Can we come to terms with such brokenness in our life? We may work so hard right now, those of you who have homes, or you're building your homes, or you're getting your BTO, you're spending so much time, to beautify your home, but your family may be in shambles. So fathers, parents here, have we helped our children to come to terms with this brokenness? Children, can you handle disappointments? Your toys break, you cry, but you know what? Your toys will break one day anyway. And the problem is, for many of us who are adults, we are still like children. We can't handle disappointments. We can't handle that things don't work in our families. Things don't work, at work. Things are not working. But are we honest about this, the past, the present, the future? That there are difficult things, that there will be difficult things that cause suffering. And if we're honest about the suffering, then perhaps we can be given grace to go through it. And that's the second point. We need to behave in times of suffering. Now, as we look at these 14 verses, there are many different sayings. They seem to be kind of unrelated, except that they are all connected by the theme of suffering. So that's a common theme that runs through this. And from these verses, we're taught how to deal with the dark clouds in our life, how to deal with this suffering. And I use the word behave on purpose. We tell our children to behave, but here God is telling us how to behave, to be wise, to be patient, right? Not to think about the past. So the first thing that he talks about is in verse 7, right? And verse 1, he says, in times of suffering, remember to be godly. So there will be things in life that will test you. In verse 7, it says, surely oppression maketh a wise man mad. Now, the word oppression here means a bribe, something that will test you to try and tempt you to do something that is wrong. So even a wise man may at times be overwhelmed when he experiences temptation to do wrong things. But in those times, we are to behave ourselves with dignity. Verse 1 says, a good name is better than precious ointment. A good reputation is better than perfume. If you've got a bad reputation, no matter what perfume you use, you'll still stink. So a good reputation is better. So in times of suffering, don't give in to temptation. Don't give in to the temptation to do wrong. Don't misbehave. Let us be resolved to be godly. Because when we suffer, the problems that come to us are all ordained by God. And so we need to deal with them in uprightness. When we get angry, when we grieve without stopping, when there's envy because of all the injustice, when we feel sad, we're not maintaining our godliness. Children, when your toys break, it's all right to cry because you're sad. But don't cry continually without hope. Don't give in to the devil. Don't despair. Ask Christ to help you. But furthermore, we deal with the dark clouds, we deal with the suffering with humility. Verse 5, it says, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. There are many of us who think we're too good to suffer. And during those times when problems come to us, we go to our foolish friends. They will tell us what we want to hear. They will affirm us We will find temporary assurances and comfort in the things that they say. But as verse 6 says, they are the crackling of thorns under a pot. You know, when you want to heat up something quickly, burn something quickly, you use thorns and kindling, right? But once you burn them, they make a lot of noise, they create a lot of heat, but afterwards, if you don't add bigger pieces of wood in, the crackling, the thorns, the kindling, it dies out, it burns out, and the pot of water won't get warm, it won't boil. So in times of suffering, when we find assurances from foolish people, they may assuage us at times, but they bring no lasting solutions and relief. So one writer has said that they provide quick flames, little heat, and lots of unpleasant noise. So foolish friends are like that. They give a lot of praise, but little honesty. They're fun, but they're not sober. And that is why rebukes are necessary. Sobriety is necessary. When we go through trouble, it's good to have true friends who will speak the truth in order to humble us. And that is why bad times are not so bad when those who care enough to say the tough things that help us through an issue. And we need their help in times of trouble. That's why we need to be humble. Right? It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. And so children, you know, your parents give you a realistic picture of life. Sometimes they give you rebukes. Receive them. You know, life on earth is not easy. School is tough. You may have fallen out with friends. There are bullies in school. You know, there's COVID today. And your parents give you sober advice. They don't always sayang you. And, you know, as a community of believers, we're not here just to sayang one another. We're here to admonish one another and love one another. That the love that we ought to give is far more than just being nice, but a love that is deeper and challenges one another. In the same way, parents, you may be struggling with your children. You may be looking for quick answers, quick solutions. Perhaps you can try repenting first. Perhaps you can try calling out to the Lord. Perhaps you can say to yourself, I never called out to the Lord all of these years. And then you rest in the Lord in His providence. So we need to take the hard words at times, you know, in humility to admit that you have the problems. You know, young families, or maybe middle age, or maybe those retired couples, there may be problems with your marriage. If you ignore them and say, you know, I don't see anything, it'll go away, it won't go away. These are things that we need in humility to deal with them. But also, we need to behave ourselves in dark times by being patient and gentle. You know, life is not smooth sailing. Verse 8, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. In other words, it says here, finishing something is better than starting it. Patience is better than pride. You know, there are some of us here who are married. We know how tough it is. You know, the beginning of a marriage is great. You move into a new house, you set up home, you know, you have little conflicts here, how you cook this, how you cook that, how you wash this dish. My mother washed this way, my father did this thing's way. But it's an exciting thing, you're getting into it. And then problems start to creep into the marriage. Continual problems. How to raise the kids, how you talk to one another. And then as you go through midway, you want to sometimes just give up. The resolve crumbles, right? Oh, you know, I didn't know when I started it that it would be this tough. It's the same thing with a job. You get a job, it's a great job, you go into the job, really happy, you guns blazing, you start off, then you start getting conflicts with colleagues, differences with bosses, organizational structure wrong, this, that, you struggle through it, work becomes really hard, you say, I just want to stop, your resolve crumbles. And that is why it says, as you go through dark clouds, the end of it is better than the beginning of it. We need to have that patience. We need to have the humility to go through something like this. And that is why Jesus said that we ought to count the cost. In speaking about following him, Jesus gave two examples. What man in Luke 14 who wants to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he can build it or not? And what person who wants to go to war does not sit down and determine whether he has enough troops to send against the opposing king. So as we go through problems, we need to be sober, to count the cost, to make it through and not just give up. Now, verse 8 gives a very beautiful picture. It says, the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Now, the word patient in spirit, or patient, is a very interesting word. It means to be long. That's where you get the word long suffering. But this is a word that is also used of birds with long wings. So it's telling you to be long-winged, right? Long-winged. When you've got small birds like the hummingbird, it beats its wings so frantically, to stay afloat, right? On the other hand, the albatross is long-winged, and it's able to span countless kilometers just by gliding and not by beating its wings. When we understand how difficult life is, when we apply ourselves to be patient and long-winged, we come through it, right? Rather than wanting to get out of it frantically and falling. And this is the word proud in spirit. Proud gives you the idea of a vertical high. You're high in spirit. So if you are frantic, you're going to fall dramatically. So this gives us a picture as we go through tough times that we must be long-winded. But when we think we're too good to suffer, that we can't deal with it, that we need to escape, that I need a divorce, that I need to take my life, all of this spirit, this response, verse 9 tells us it comes from an angry spirit. So dearly beloved, when we go through dark clouds, we have to be realistic. They are there. Don't close your eyes to them. Confront them. But behave as you go through them with godliness, humility, patience, gentleness. And in order to do this, Solomon says that we need wisdom. That's the last point. We need wisdom to suffer well. And we see this wisdom, the value of wisdom, in verses 11 and 12. It says, wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense. But the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. So what do you need to get through difficult, dark times? So Solomon suggests this. You need wisdom and you need money. Both are good. If you have both, it's great. But if you really want to compare the two, only wisdom can save your life. Money may be good, but you may have money but no wisdom, then how? All right? We all think when we go through problems, what we need is money. What we need is security. But Solomon is saying wisdom is better. Wisdom actually saves your life. So if you have wisdom, you are honest about suffering in this life. If you are wise, then you can go through your suffering with godliness, humility, patience, and gentleness. Children, are A's in class good? A's are good, right? A's are wonderful. But so what if you have A's and you're the kind of child that cannot get through your disappointments and you just fall apart? It's no use, right? No use at all. What's the use, beloved, of a nicely renovated house? It can't save your family from conflict. And this is why suffering is good, failure is good, opposition is good. They teach us wisdom. Rather than ignoring them and going out to party, we ought to face them, accept that they happen, behave ourselves as we go through them. And when we obtain wisdom to live despite these problems, we are better for it, because as verse 3 again says, by the sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better. So I want to end off by asking, what are some practical applications that we can apply here? What can we draw from this passage? I think firstly, let us cultivate sobriety. Yes, vaccinated travel lane is good if it lasts. But let's talk about the shortness of life. Families, you've gone to the SQ website, you're responsible for crashing it. You think, oh, what kind of vacation can I take? How wonderful. Have you ever talked to one another that you could die? You could die. I could die. Let's be sober. Let's talk about those things. Let's say to one another that if I die, what's going to happen to the kids? If our kids die, what's going to happen to us? Focus and be sober on those things. Perhaps you should ask yourself, am I making my calling and election sure? Am I prepared to meet God? My father, is he going to be my father, or is he my judge? Children, have you called upon Jesus to save you? Because as we talk about these things, as we accept and as we identify all of these things, then our hearts can be sobered, it can be made glad, because we need to realize, as verse 14 tells us, that God, who sends times of prosperity, he also sends times of hardship so we can consider, so we can think. So that's the first thing that we can do. Secondly, since suffering and opposition are from God, there are opportunities to learn obedience, how to behave yourself. Jesus, he suffered greatly as he went through all of his various trials. Hebrews 5 tells us that he learned obedience. He exercised himself to obedience through these trials he suffered. When he was struck, he did not strike back. When he was crucified, he asked God to forgive. As we saw in Acts 8, the Ethiopian eunuch asked, what does this mean? He as a lamb to his shearers, he did not oppose them. And that is why during these times, because Christ has gone through them, he is able to comfort us when we go through our troubles. But when we ignore our troubles, when we say, it's not there, Mayo, I did not see anything, then you will not experience this grace and this mercy that God so freely gives. As Psalm 119, verse 71 says, it is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. So in this time of uncertainty, are there things that you need to get right with God? And again, I say, whichever narrative you believe in, what is still the case is that vaccinated people are still dying. And thirdly, the third application is this. We thank God that these dark clouds can draw us closer to Christ. The disciples, happy, happy, joy, joy, all this time, they went out by 70s, 2 by 2, healing. They marveled at, and they came out to Christ. Well, even the demons listened to us. They were so happy. And they went around with great hope. Jesus is the Messiah. I'm going to be second or first in the kingdom after him. But then what happened? Jesus told them, I'm going to die. They had such great hope that Jesus was the Messiah. But when the guards came, they fled. When confronted, Peter denied Christ. When he was crucified, they were at a distance grieving. From the 6th to the 9th hour, there was only darkness. But we know why there was darkness. There was darkness. He was facing the wrath of God so that we can be saved. Christ had to die to bring us to God. There are dark clouds. And yet all of us here are always looking for silver linings here under the sun. Christ faced dark judgment to bring us to a place where there is no darkness, in the life beyond, where there is light eternal. And we, under the sun, we're trying to look for the silver linings here. Let us, once in a while, look at the dark clouds and welcome them and see how we can be made the better, to draw nearer to Christ, to do things which are more worth it. You know, sorry to harp on this vaccinated travel lane thing, but what a wonderful thing if you were to go and be able to go and to minister to folks in other countries who need the gospel. So we look frantically for silver linings, but those of us who are in Christ must see the wisdom of the dark clouds, because the Father who brought Christ these dark clouds is the same one that brings to us our dark clouds, because he has given us a shepherd who will shepherd us through these valleys of the shadow of death, and by his rod and staff comforts us. Maybe what we can do is talk about the dark clouds today and draw closer to God. Let's pray. Our gracious God, eternal Father, indeed two are better than one. What we have is better than what we do not have, but indeed the dark clouds are also better than the silver linings, the false hopes that we have. Help us as we are sober to draw closer to you, to live for you, to get right with you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.